Hi guys, this is CC from Beer Bubbles. Normally we release the podcast every second Friday, but this time we had to split the interview in two parts, so the next one will be launched in a week. Coming up is part one of our talk about Swedish beer history with Joel Hedman. Enjoy.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the number one bubbliest podcast in the world, we think. I'm here with Cici.
Yes, I'm here as always.
And yet again, Mr. Joel Hedman.
Hello, nice to be here again.
Welcome to Beer Bubbles.
You joined us for an episode a couple of months back where we talked a lot about barley wines, sours, cheese, for example. And now you're back, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into the Swedish beer history. But maybe before that, you can give the audience a reminder of who you are and a deeper explanation of why you are who you are.
Why I do what I do and how I do what I do.
Exactly.
Everything I do because I find it interesting. And I started guiding, I think we might be approaching 15 years now. It's been a companion of mine, Swedish history and beer. It's been with me the same amount of time, more or less. And therefore, I like beer. Quality beer. I've been a beer judge for a while, and I've been into beer for, well, I think it's approaching 15 years, at least over 12 years. And history and guiding has been with me as long. And combining those two is, of course, something that I want to do. And then we put a little cheese on the side of that, so that's what I do.
Because you are from Agia as well.
Yes. Yeah. So Stockholm's history.
All good things in life.
Yeah, the things that I like, which means talking about beer or talking about history or trying beer and cheese. That's sort of what I do.
Yeah.
What began that interest for you? Was it something that sparked it?
Are we talking the history or the beer? Because
the history of you.
The history of me. The reason I started guiding and started being interested in history is because I applied for a job without really knowing what the job was. I wanted to do something else, so I applied for it. Turned out to be a cruise guide job, doing the cruise ship tours in Stockholm. I wasn't sure if I was going to be on a ship. I didn't really know what it was. I just applied for it, and it turned out to be the most fun I've ever had in my life, guiding people on buses coming from the cruise ships. And that's when I started guiding.
So you kept on?
Yeah, it was just fun. Most people do that as a summer job because the tourism is mainly the summer season, but I just loved it so much that I do it. We're a few crazy people that try to live off of this. But it's nice that I can supplement that with my other interest, which is beer.
That's nice. So you combined it, basically.
Yeah. So I do tastings, and I talk beer history, and I talk Stockholm history. And beer has been with me since I started trying other stuff than macro lagers, and I realized this is really nice. And I sort of realized I hadn't really liked beer before, and now I knew why, because that wasn't as good as the real beer that I started to try.
What was the first beer that made you realize that this is not just macro lagers?
Honestly,
macro lagers aren't everything.
I don't really know, but I think it was something on the British side, some British ale of some sort. I remember in the beginning, I was very focused on color. I thought it was, okay, if it has a different color, then maybe it's a little better. So I was like, okay, if it goes a little darker, then it has more flavor. And then, well, it just went deeper and deeper and deeper into sort of learning more and more and more. And the more you go into both history and beer, the more you know that you don't know it all and you'll never be done. And I'm just continuing and continuing and continuing, I guess.
Well, that's the fun of it.
Oh yeah, learning is that's one of the main reasons why I ended up here at Akkurat. It's because I felt I wasn't learning anymore, and I came here and I realized I know absolutely nothing. I need to know more.
That's how I feel. And shout out to Akkurat, our sponsors,
our main sponsor,
our workplace where we're sitting at right now.
Yes.
They looked at us weirdly, asked us what we're doing here on a day off. We're recording a podcast, we said, with Mr. Joel Hedman, so this is what we're doing. The first question, basically, to start off the episode, because we're going to talk a lot about history and go deep diving for reals. From the beginning, going forward, what types of beer have people been drinking in Sweden?
Well, the thing is, it's very difficult to be precise in that regard. We know that beer, if we talk about beer's been around for like 9,000 years, give or take. but we've been brewing with what we have. That's what people do. And when it comes to when we can start seeing like descriptions of beer, it's very difficult to find those because generally speaking, we don't talk about the everyday things. Like history is about the kings and about the spectacular events and things like that. So finding a description on beer is very difficult historically. But we know on, like, in some cases what ingredients have been used, and that must have done something to the beer. We don't know how well it would have fermented, for example. We don't know what type of yeast would have been in there. But there have been a few very interesting examples where beer has actually come to life, historic beer, like in the case of Archetyp, which is brewed by
Nynäshamn.
Nynäshamn. That's a fun one because that was from an old grave. If I'm not mistaken, that was actually in Denmark, but we have a similar history, and that was around, I think, the 1st century, like about near 100, something like that. And they found an old grave with a young woman in it, and she had a drinking vessel, and they could find out what had been inside it, finding the ingredients and figuring out what was inside it. And let's see, I think it was lingonberry, it was honey, and if I'm not mistaken, it was birch.
Birch sap.
Birch sap, which has been used in some fun ways. It feels like a very cheap, I'm not even sure if that's beer, but they talk about that in the 1600s, that they used birch sap and flour to make a drink, which doesn't sound very nice. But anyways, so we know things like that they used a bunch of berries and birch sap, and it was wheat that they found in there. So that beer I've actually tried, and I know, but as I don't know what the yeast was, it's very difficult to know what the end product was. But we have an idea.
Well, we might just have an archetype later on, because I know we have some down in the basement.
Oh, really?
Cool. Yeah, still left here at Akkurat. But I want to come back to, we talked about you brew with what you have.
Yeah.
And then we come to the natural conclusion of no one knew what yeast was. They knew all the other ingredients.
Yeah.
That is one of the reasons beer has been surrounded by so much mystique and rituals, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. It's they knew everything except for the yeast, but they knew they had to do it, but they didn't understand how it worked. And I'm always trying to figure out, like, how did they brew the first batch? Because everything you hear about is, well, you use the yeast from your previous batch and you put it into the new one. But the first one must have been spontaneous fermented of some sort. Yeah. But anyways, the way they did it was that they put in these, they used to have it in Historiska Museet, these sort of wooden contraptions, which has a lot of nooks and crannies in it where yeast would latch on. So you had dried yeast, so when you put it in, it would activate. So you literally had and they thought that carried power and you had to put it in there. But in fact, the reason it worked was because they had yeast on that specific
and shouting
thing.
And screaming and dancing naked around the barn was also part of the ritual, kind of.
Yeah, and another funny thing about that is it was very important to be happy when you brewed, because the sensation when you brewed, it came through when you were sitting drinking the beer later. So you'd be smiling and in some cases, as you said, screaming to get the evil spirits away and stuff like that.
It sounds like a horrible cult movie.
Yeah. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall. But I didn't really answer your first question, because the styles that we've been drinking, I just want to make a little bit of a bridge here. We're going to go through them because we have a few beers here today. Yeah. I'm going to talk about some of the styles that we know, or some of the ingredients that we know that we have used historically, but it has changed quite a bit over time. So I'm going to give that answer slowly throughout the following.
This question will be followed through the entire episode. You said to me that around 1600s or the 1700s, we actually start to know what kind of history Sweden have, or is it earlier than that?
No, I mean, when it comes to beer, I think we have some documentation. It feels like most things that are that we still have a record of starts roughly around the time as Christianity comes around. Before that, we're more or less in the, feels like it's all a little bit of it's often written after the fact, and it's more of a story.
But before that, we had more of an oral tradition than we had of a written down history. And Christianity kind of brought writing. Well, at least Latin came in as the mystique language.
Yeah,
kinda.
very much. But we do have, like, I mean, the Vikings wrote short things down in rune stones, as we know, but also people observed the Vikings because they did many fun things or not so fun. So we know some things about the Vikings of horrible rituals that visitors have written about. But it's difficult to know how much of that is true and how much of it is sort of pissing on your enemy sort of a thing.
And a Scottish friend of mine told me once that I hated Swedes and Norwegians. And I said, why? Because your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather raped my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother.
Well, possibly.
I'm sorry.
Could be.
I'm sorry. Let's have pints. All right. So, shall we go to the first beer then? And you can talk a little bit about that and where we begin in the.
Yeah.
Where should we start? And
Story
what are
part.
we starting with? If you give me the bottle, you can tell me about the beer and I'll open it for us.
I can
The,
open.
the thing is, maybe I'm not sure if this one is a little old. I had this in my. We could do either one of these. Maybe we start with that one because I brought two of the same thing. I wasn't sure which one we'd have on camera or on mic or whatever. I might have shook that one a little bit. But the main point of the first beer is to have something with
Looks live.
with posh in it, and that would be Mythica Gale, is I think the English name for it. I wrote it down just to make sure I wouldn't mess this up, and then still I messed this up. I'll start it over. Let's see.
Rewind. Well, it does do
Anyway.
live though, so it's
You know I
It's
will
alive.
keep this. I will not edit this out.
No, I edited nothing.
don't do that.
No, but anyways, it's an herb that would give a bittering component, somewhat of a preservation effect, but not as much as hops.
But it was instead of hops, basically.
Yeah, instead of hops. Yeah.
And the beer is from Närke Kulturbryggeri.
Yeah, and
Yes.
it's called Posh and Tvash.
Yeah.
Where posh is not posh as in like high class. It's
No.
The plant.
I think
is
it
all
actually
green leaves,
says-
right?
Yeah.
it's
the
the
bitter
herb.
sweet type of-
Murica Gale, if you want to
Murica
say
Gale.
that. Murica Gale. It
Murica
actually said on
Gale.
the bottle.
Okay, good.
So genius as I
We'll,
am.
we'll take a photograph of the label and put it up in our social medias as well.
So I brought two of those, but we'll take one at a time. But the thing is, hops was something that we said previously. We've said that it came with the monks and the nuns, that they would grow hops, that they would come in with that influence. But that has been sort of changed in our history books rather recently, that we now say it came, that the Vikings probably brought with them hops and grew it. But it took a little while before it became commonplace to have hops in beers. In Central Europe, it's somewhere around, I think, year 1000 that hops starts to get the dominant spice.
Bittering agent of beer. But
Whereas,
it's I think 1380 something. The first Reinheitsgebot in Germany was actually because they didn't want people to kill themselves because they had so many herbs that were bitter agents that were kind of poisonous,
yeah,
and they tried to get people to use hops instead.
yeah.
And it's probably someone who owned a big field of hops who
Yeah.
put that law in place.
It feels a little
Probably.
suspicious that they have a lot of barley and they have a lot of hops there, and they're like, "We know what you need to have in beer."
Well, cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers. Should we do a little? Okay.
It's almost got like a juniper berry note to it as well,
Yeah. Let's see what you mean there.
and it's very herbal.
Yeah, very much so.
Mm.
Interesting with the smell is that it smells like a brewery instead of like a finished beer. It smells like when
smells
you're inside
like
a brewery.
Something
when you
is,
brew the beer.
yeah,
It smells a bit like wort,
yeah.
yeah.
That's usually what
but
a brewery
not
smells
unpleasant at all. It's like it's
like. No, not unpleasant.
this is
No,
really.
brewery smells
On the other
nice.
hand, Närke Kulturbryggeri does some really good stuff, and this is
Oh.
And what they also do is that they like to honor history, so they tend to do fun historic styles.
yeah. They did their Julita series with ancient hops as
Oh,
well
yeah.
from Julita. Mm.
They've done a lot of fun things like that. But anyways, Posh or Murica Gale, if I'm saying that correctly,
Murica Gale, yes.
has been, I'd say, it was the standard, but you used a bunch of other herbs to spice the beer. But this would be, I'd say, the standard. And in the cities, I'd say somewhere around maybe 1400s, it started to become more common with hops. But it feels like in the countryside, they would have used other spices for centuries after that. So
Wormwood.
Yeah, wormwood. Yeah, that always sounds good when you say wormwood. Operation Wormwood. Anyway, so they have been sort of parallel. Nothing is like, okay, today we start using hops. So you could have used both, and it also depends on your how much access you have to hops.
But Mörkergale and wormwood were the main components to spice brännvin or hard liquor as well.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it has a connection when it comes to spicing drinks. The spicing of brännvin is usually to make you well. If you're ill of something, you need these spices or something like that. So it's connected in that way as well. And you have the same spices in beer historically.
And you hide ugly flavors and aromas as well with it. So,
yeah, of course, yeah. We've had some really interesting drinks that you could, including getting rid of the plague, for example. I don't think that worked, but
today you would use them to remove paint.
Yes.
Well, this is really nice.
Mm. Yeah, it is. It's very well balanced as well. I imagine probably how historically speaking, you think this is the nearest like comparison you can go, or to find like how it actually tasted like back in the day.
No, I think you're going to have to. We're going to get to that. I think it would have all been smoky because the beers that we would drink historically. I'm a little nervous how much that is going to start. Okay, what? No, but everything would have been smoky in Swedish history because you roasted your malts or your barley under an open fire, so it would have been smoke came into the beer. We're going to get a little bit more into that, but smoke would have been a component. The yeast would most likely have been not top quality. It was not Carlsbergensis all the way through.
It was some kind of wild or farmhouse yeast. And that's the thing as well. Like there is written documentation about certain farms and certain farm owners that you wanted to go to a party at, and some that you didn't want to go to a party at, because the beer was so much better at some farms.
Definitely.
So they had their own culture, basically yeast culture.
Most likely, we would have had the same yeast as you would find in Norway, for example, Kveik yeast, because they have the same history with it drying on those little wooden contraptions. And that the dry yeast you could use really easily again and again, and it can be fermented at really high temperatures as well. So most likely you would have found something similar to Kveik.
And it's quite fast as well.
Yeah, very,
and
very fast.
You wanted your drink now.
Yeah. Okay, I'm thirsty. I wanted yesterday. So, yes. I think definitely it was something that and it was fermented.
I've got to ask you about because I've poured the second beer here called Joars Gästabud, and it's from Mullegorm. No?
What?
Where is it from? What it's?
It would have been great for me to know this.
If you look at the backside, it's got a web address there called Mullegorm.
Mullegorm. Kies-Uddens Hantverksbryggeri.
Ah, okay.
The thing is, I only looked for beers that would have the correct spices. It has a nice Viking drinking from a horn on the it
on
looks
the
like
label,
a Viking anyway.
Legit.
Joars Gästabud. And this one I chose because it contains both the Gale, I'll just say Gale, because then I don't have to say the other one, and honey, which I'm going to get into a little bit as well. But this is a lot darker, and if we just talk about what the beer looked like when you poured it, it did not have a healthy head.
No, it died right away.
It fizzled away immediately. So we'll see how this feels.
There's a tiny bit left.
Cheers.
Cheers.
You can definitely feel that it's the same kind of spiciness than the first one, but it feels much stronger and it feels much more potent.
Yeah, I think it was disguised a little better in the other beer, or in the first beer.
It reminds me of herb liquor.
And you get more roasted notes from the because there's more roasted malt in this one than it was in the first one.
Plus, the honey has made it a little bit more potent. This is 7.4% ABV.
Yeah, and the first one was 5.9.
Like the sweetness, or maybe it wasn't from the beginning, but correct me if I'm wrong now, but does honey stay with the sweetness?
No. Honey is fermentable sugars.
Yeah.
That's why we're going to come to mead later on, but that's why mead becomes strong. And it becomes, you end up with a drink that's around 10%, 10, 11.
Yeah.
And that's because all the sugars in the honey, basically, you ferment out.
So this can have been sweeter when it was freshly made then?
Well, it would have been sweeter before you fermented it.
Yeah.
The wort would have been sweeter.
Yeah, I think this is the same. It's a funny thing. I remember it was an eye opener for me. If you wanna brew a beer that's less sweet, add more sugar.
Yeah,
that's a weird one, because honey has a little bit of its own flavor. We don't talk about, like, you can smell honey and you think that it smells sweet, but sweetness is actually a flavor. But you know that this is something that I connect to something sweet.
Yeah.
So you might have a flavor that you think is sweet, but it is fermented out. I would say complete. I'm not sure if they leave anything, but I think honey.
But it's the same. Lots of people percept like Belgian Trappist beers as sweet, but most of them are quite dry.
Yes,
because they're fermented so hard. But you associate like aromas and flavors with something sweet.
Yeah, the really sweet ester profiles and the fact that they're stronger tends to make them sweeter in aroma.
How do you? When I've been drinking honey beer, I find they're very floral if they have a lot of honey in them. Like for the
depends on what honey you use.
Yeah, but it depends on what honey you use. But as I found so far, I haven't had a lot of honey beer. It's not everybody sells it. So
that's when you use exclusive honey. Most likely, then you get the floral. I know. Speaking of Närkes, that they used some specific honey. I should have brought the Mölska from them. I realize now because I think I have one bottle left. But that's the same. That's the same honey that they used for the Stormakts Porter.
Okay,
They used a very specific local honey with that is a big part of the flavor profile of the Stormakts Porter.
And Kaggen, if you don't know, it was number one on Rate Beer's list of best beers in the world for I think 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, might have been even more.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's still up there in top 10.
Yeah. And it's still a pretty awesome beer.
It is. And if you want it, you can come here, because we have it here as well. This is turning into advertisement for Acrobat. But
well, we work here, and they're our sponsors, so what the fuck.
and it's well worth a visit. So
they haven't told us we can't swear, so fuck that.
Very good.
Both very interesting. And
should I open the smoke beer now and pour that as well, so we can go over to what beers traditionally should have would have tasted like?
Because I've done these sort of historic beer tastings before, where I've taken beer, what it has tasted like, essentially what we're doing now, and then in some cases you might need to adjust the beer, because everybody wants to brew beer that you want to drink and buy when you're a commercial brewery, but historically it would have been more probably a little bit sour, so we could go and sort of pour some of these together to get a better idea and better understanding what the beer would have been like. We should have had some vinegar, for example. If we add a little vinegar, we'd get some of that little tart, sour note to it. And this beer that we just poured is a lager beer, so it's going to be a little too clean. So if you want to make it more ale, you pour some other things into it. But anyways, maybe I should introduce...
This is from the most... Well, this is the only smoke beer you can find at Systembolaget in Sweden.
Yeah, well, except, at least from Beställningssortimentet you can get from... Hälsinge.
Yeah. And that's a much lighter smoke beer. This is from Bamberg in Germany. It's one of the most traditional breweries there called Schlenkerla.
Yeah.
I really like this one.
Smells like salami.
Yeah.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. And tastes like salami.
Before this, we talked about Märzen, and this is actually their Märzen style.
Yeah.
So Well,
so we can use this as a way of getting in there, anyways, a little bit later. But this is a good way of understanding what the smoked flavor would be. And when it comes to beer, roasting malts, there are some examples of you just letting your malt dry in the sun, for example. There are some examples of that historically, but mostly it was roasted under a fire. And
over fire.
Over, yeah, not under. That would have been, then they would have been a very dark beer process. Strange process that we use. No, but from the 1600s.
But he wouldn't use the fire, they'd use the hot air with the smoke, and that's why you get the smoke.
Yeah, I'm simplifying it maybe in a strange way, but you get what I mean, I think. But the first sort of where you get the smoke to actually exit without having to interfere with the malts, these sort of chimney-looking thing.
Like separators mainly?
That came in the 1600s. We have documents of that. So there were some people that managed to brew beers that were not smoky at all, more on a bigger scale from the 1600s.
So basically before that, almost all beers were smoky and tart.
Yeah, probably. The tart part, the only way we know about the tartness would be in some examples where we have visitors coming to Sweden writing about what the beers taste like. Those are actually pretty fun. Most of those appear in the 1600s as well, because that's the first time people wanted to visit when we were a great power. No, but it was actually a little easier to come over in the 1600s compared to before. It was still not super easy, but it was a lot of restrictions. You had to have a passport, even if you were Swedish, to only travel within Sweden. You needed a passport, and it just 1600s made us a little bit more international.
Well, we had a big fleet of trade going on in the Eastern Sea, mainly during the 1600s as well.
Yes, definitely.
And we had some kings who tried to take over the world.
Yeah, and in some ways succeeded. And,
yeah.
But anyways, what I'm trying to say is we had some people coming in writing about like what it's like to be in Sweden, and those are really fun to read, these accounts. We got a bunch of French people, or at least two I read the accounts of, back to back. They wrote quite a bit. And a few Italians. One guy came over and he saw when they brought out the cannons from the Vasa ship with the old school diving bells, and he also wrote about the weird drinking traditions in Sweden. In some of these examples, we also have a Danish guy who complained about the beer. That's actually the reason we know about this is not because he wrote about it, but because it got to court, because he got so pissed off. He was at the Royal Palace drinking beer, so he's apparently an important Danish guy, but he got so pissed off that he broke the plates and screamed and poured everything out and was acting like a maniac. And the interesting part of this is it got all the way up to court, and they dismissed it because they said, okay, you say that the beer was sour, but that's not very strange because it was summertime. So it's like, okay, the beer was sour, but that's okay because it was summer.
But hop history in Sweden is kind of weird as well. A couple of years back, I think it was Nordisk Museet, they had a big hops exhibition, and I was there and I interviewed the woman who was in charge of everything, and that was really cool to see the history of Swedish hops.
Yeah.
And it was a national law that you had to grow hops if you had a certain amount of acres of farmland.
Yeah. That comes back time and time again. And I think it goes back to, I think it's 1350s for the first time when it becomes obligatory. And I think it's Magnus Eriksson's Landslag. I'm not sure. But then it's obligatory that if you have a certain amount of land, you grow this and this much. But it also comes back with Gustav Vasa in the 1500s. And by then, he has a big part in church because we're Lutheran. So 10% goes to church, vis-a-vis, in other words, the king. So by that point, it was...
Because it was the king's hops.
Yeah. Yeah.
You were allowed to use it, but if the king came along, you had to give it away.
Yeah. Yeah. He needed hops. And he was really pissed off. Gustav Vasa was really pissed off because so much money went to Germany to buy hops. It was at its worst. It's somewhere in the beginning of the 1500s. I believe somewhere around 10% of the total income to Sweden from iron ore, which was our biggest export. 10% of that money went towards Germany to buy hops. And you need to remember
that's a lot of money.
that we used a few 100 grams of hops per 100 kilos of malt. So it was not like an IPA where you use a lot of hops. It was just moderately hopped, but still. So that's how much beer we drank back in those days. So.
And I heard also that the king actually sent surveyors out to see if you followed these laws. The punishments were quite harsh. They range from everything from fine to actually death penalty if you were a big landowner and just didn't grow any hops for the king.
Yeah.
But the farms north of Sundsvall got an exception, and he sent out a survey to see, and the survey came back and said, well, the climate's just not good enough for growing hops up there.
Sweden sounds like a fun place back in the day.
Yeah, it was,
for beer drinkers or beer lovers.
The funny thing is also that nobody was allowed to drink German beers there for a while because Gustav Vasa got so pissed off and it was so expensive. So the only people drinking the imports was essentially the king and his buddies, because we had one of those like up by Stortorget. We had the one really like fancy bar or restaurant where they would have import wines and import beers, and nobody was really allowed to drink those. So I just feel like he was the bully telling everybody else what to do, and he was the guy drinking all the beer coming in from Germany. So,
but what's the story about? Because we didn't just drink beer; we drank mead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And braggot.
Yes, definitely. The braggot or the mölska is like the way of combining the ingredients that you have.
Because mead is basically honey and water.
Yes.
That ferments.
It would have been just honey, but you need a little bit more liquid to be able to drink it. So, yeah, you just mix up honey and water, and then, you ferment that. And then you get a rather strong.
And a mölska is basically a beer that you mix with honey, so you get the fermentation from the honey as well.
Yeah. And the way I've seen it described throughout, like, the Middle Ages is that you would have, like, you had a little jar of honey in your cupboard, or, well, somewhere. Cupboard might, well, anyways, in storage. And if there was a big party, you wanted to have an extra strong, like one extra strong beer, you go in and you take that honey and you dump it into your batch, and you make a stronger festive beer, or, well, that makes it a braggot or a mölska in Swedish. Yeah.
But with mead, did adding fruits come later, or is that also historical? Like did they add fruit as well?
Well, it seems like we've always, as long as it becomes, if it can become alcohol, then we like it. Yeah.
All right.
So I mean, I think that the birch sap thing describes that best. Like, who would have thought of that otherwise?
Well, it's sweet. If a man's
do it get drunk. Yes, let's make it.
Yeah. So
I always imagine the first guy who tried beer when the spontaneous yeast. Some lone guy on a farm.
Tastes like shit, but I get
Sparrow.
But it's fun.
What is that water bubbling in there? It tastes, got drunk, like, oh, let's do that again.
Yeah.
But how do you study the history? Like, since there's nothing, like, one book written down, like, this is the history of the beer in Sweden, or...
No, well, there's actually one, there's one, like, the book, if you will. I have it here somewhere. Well, it's in 2 volumes, but it's a little outdated, and he uses very historic Swedish sometimes. But it's essentially the history of beer in Sweden, is what it says. It's what it's called. But generally speaking, you got to find tidbits here and there. There are a few people that have written about alcoholic beverages throughout Swedish history, and then you find something about beer. But what I try to do is find the original source. If I read something and they mention something, okay, I want to find that one. Like, for example, in the case of the people visiting from other places, that's really fun, because that way you go in and you find the original book, and you can read more than what the person...
Than just the exempt.
Yeah. So I'm not an historian in the way that I go in to dig into archives and find the actual original, but I want to find the whole story. So... You got to read many books, but a little bit of every book.
Guys, I'm just gonna say that this episode is gonna be in 2 parts, because it's gonna be too long to do one part, because we're still not done. We're far from it. Yeah. So we're gonna take a little break, and you guys are gonna have to listen to us in the next episode, the end of this lovely podcast with...
Whatever you do, wait for us.
Yes.
All right.
Wait for better beer.
Wait for better beer.
Okay.
All right. See you soon.
Cheers.
Cheers.
That's it for this time. Make sure you tune in next Friday for the second part of our beer history talk with Joel Edman. And until then, drink better beer.